Good afternoon, everybody. Today is 30th April, and we are having our regular meeting. It's a very important topic and a very skilled person who is going to talk about human rights and the importance of human rights today. So I think this will be a really key discussion that will have a fundamental importance for Sri Lankan recovery. So just before, as usual, I just have to take 5 minutes to make a few updates and announcements. And I just want to tell you a little bit about our workshop that is planned for 25th May 2023 at Magona. Not Magona, it will be at Mavanalla. And it will be a hybrid workshop as usual. We have roughly the program. So the school principal there is supporting the whole program. And we have just 10 minutes for me to introduce leads. And then Lakmal Jayaratne, who is a director in agriculture in the same area, will introduce the subject, why Sri Lankan farmers cannot develop. And we're talking about farming community, exploring the burning issues. That will be a Q&A directed by or explored by Kapila and Ranjan together, so that we'll be able to, because I expect the most of the audience going to be farmers, so that we can ask from them and find out exactly what they need to be improving or what help they need and etc. Then we have Gamini Senratne from Professor, who will be talking about modernizing the farmers, and he spoke to us about biofertilizers some time ago. And then after that, about communal harmony, again, Soraya Dean is going to talk about that, because that's also important in relation to just not various communities, and also various branches in farming itself has to unite as well. So to do that, we will get some expertise from Mohan Samarkand, who is a well-known charity person also in Kandy, about tips for success. And then followed by, we are thinking about launching a federation for Sri Lankan farmers. And again, Kapila Gunasekara and Vijaya Jayatilaka, who is a good social harmony promoter, will interact with that. So the afternoon, as usual, will be for the children about risk management. And Kitsiri is going to talk about lightning and road safety, Ranjan De Silva. And I really want a speaker for illicit drugs, just for half an hour. If somebody can talk a little bit about the bad side of illicit drugs to children, I welcome that. I don't have a speaker for that yet. And the resuscitation training will be led by Asanga Nanakar, who is the president of the Sri Lanka Life Saving. And I really thank him for putting his time to this. So today we are talking about human rights, and it's so important. And that's why we are trying to get it into our constitution. And this means the rights inherent to all human beings, regardless of race, sex, nationality, ethnicity, language, religion, or any other status. And so without that, we will not expect peace, respect, and humanity in Sri Lanka. So that is why we included in our, if you look at our website, there is a petition that's being, still I'm collecting signatures. The very first item in this petition is about including human rights in our constitution. So please get sign or promote this petition as well, because we are hoping to take this to Supreme Court this year at some point. So Nilmini, I've already sent an introduction about Nilmini and a little brief about Nilmini and about her biodata as well. She's got so many achievements, and I just want to briefly mention a little bit so that everybody understands this bit. So she's a lawyer, founder and a principal solicitor of Roelens Solicitors. And she became Supreme Court, Solicitor of the Supreme Court in England in 1991, and obtained a degree in law in France in French. And then she got interested in immigration law. So, so she got Law Society accreditation as a supervisor in immigration law. And then became a member of the highly regarded Law Society of Immigration Law, New Globa. And one other aspect is he's contributed to the all-party parliamentary group for international freedom of religion and belief. So she led the fundraising campaign last year, worked for Lanka, collected money, and to support the vulnerable people in Sri Lanka during the financial crisis. And she speaks in French, English, of course, French, Sinhala, Mandarin Chinese, Spanish, and German. So you can ask a question in any language and she will answer, I'm sure. So Nilmini, welcome you.
Hi, thank you so much, Chula. Thank you for the introduction and thanks for inviting me. Just by way of quick commentary, I speak French and Sinhalese fluently, but with regard to the Mandarin and the German and the Spanish, it's very elementary, I'm afraid, very basic. So I hope nobody will ask me any questions in those three languages. Anyway, let me just see if I can share screen and share with you the PowerPoint that I prepared. On this, as should have said, it's a very important topic of human rights. There are so many aspects to human rights that I'm sure you're familiar with the concepts in relation to human rights, but there are many aspects to human rights that we don't kind of note and recognize. So that's why I thought it might be useful to discuss this in some detail. Let me just see if I can find my slides. Okay. You'll have to bear with me because I'm a little bit IT challenged, so I'm not particularly proficient at moving back and forth between Zoom and PowerPoint, but let's have a go anyway. Okay, so why are human rights important? It's because human rights are rights that we simply have by being human beings. They're universal rights and they're inherent to us all. So that's irrespective of what your nationality is, your gender, your origin, your ethnic group, your color, your religion, your language, or any other status. So fundamental, and so ranging from the right to life, to exist, to what makes life worth living. Things like the right to food and education, work, health, and liberty. Those are all part of the fundamental group of human rights. So these basic rights and freedoms belong to every person in the world from the moment you're born until you die. It really is, it applies whether or not, where you're, depending on, it doesn't matter where you come from or what you believe or how you decide to choose to lead your life. They can be restricted in certain limited circumstances. For example, if you break the law or in the interest of national security, but those must be very sparingly used to limit your human rights. So the basic rights are based on shared values of dignity, fairness, equality, respect, and independence that applies to all human beings across all nations. And they're defined and protected by the law. The history of human rights has, it's been around for quite some time, but it's really in the post-Second World War period that this became particularly important and compelling because of what happened during the Holocaust. And so in 1948, in order to prevent future violations of the human rights of one's own population, the UN adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There are 30 articles, and that Universal Declaration laid the foundation for human rights law across the world, and brought about many other they are broadly divided into two categories, because states have duties not only in relation to each other between states, but also towards the individuals who live within it. So it's really about the individual's rights as well as the obligations of the state. And so you've got civil and political rights on the one hand, and then economic, social, and cultural rights on the other. Those are the rights of the individual vis-a-vis the state. So in relation to civil and political rights, but you have the right to participate in public life and be protected from state oppression. So you must be protected from torture. You must have freedom of speech. You must have a right to a fair trial. Those are, for example, the civil and political rights. There are many others, of course. Then you've got economic and social and cultural rights. And these meet basic needs. It's about quality of life. And these relate to things like the right to work, right to food, education, and right to found a family thing. So underlying these two sets of rights, you've got the principles, such as the principle of equality and the principle of non-discrimination. And you've got human rights laws at three different levels. On the one hand, you've got the international level, which are basically the human rights treaties between states. And then you've got regional level set of human rights laws. And those could be the areas, for example, the European one, the African one, the American one. For example, the European Convention on Human Rights, ECHR, it's a regional instrument. Then you've got national laws that protect human rights. You've got the constitution of each country, for example, that might provide for the protection of human rights, and maybe the other national laws that are enacted. So the state's obligations, they're binding treaties and conventions and laws that a state has usually signed up to. So there are also the customary laws of the country, and there are standards of human rights that are applicable in different countries. So you've got to kind of look at the context as well as what countries have signed up to. So the state must respect and fulfill their obligation to protect the individual rights. So the state can't violate your rights as an individual, and they also have an obligation to take positive steps to make sure that your individual rights are protected. There is I've put a few brief videos into this presentation, and if I may, I'll just share that with you, simply because it gives you a good broad understanding of the different things. And this one's about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. As I said, I hope I can come back to the PowerPoint presentation after showing this.
What is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? International law visualized. In 1948, the UN General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights under Article 55 of the Charter to promote universal respect and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. Comprising 30 substantive articles, the Universal Declaration set out the fundamental rights to be guaranteed to all people, like dignity, liberty, equality, and brotherhood, the right to life, and the prohibition of slavery, the individual rights in civil and political society, and the freedom of religion and association, in addition to social, economic, and cultural rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights has, since its adoption, exercised a powerful impact throughout the world, both internationally and nationally, and have been quoted as justification for various measures taken by the United Nations, and have inspired many international conventions, and influenced national constitutions, municipal legislation, and court decisions. Although not legally binding, the contents of the Declaration have been incorporated into subsequent international treaties, human rights instruments, national constitutions, and laws, and as a code of conduct or a yardstick to measure the degree of compliance with the international standards of human rights. From the Universal Declaration came the legally binding international covenants on civil and political rights, and on economic, social, and cultural rights.
Okay, so that's a little bit about the background. So it's a declaration. That's what it is. But moving on, can you see the screen? I've moved on. Just want to make sure that you can see it. So there are lots of different human rights treaties following on from this declaration. So you've got the Refugee Convention, for example, and you've got the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Covenant and Civil and Political Rights Covenant, and various other conventions, including the Children's Convention, etc. Then you've got these conventions and protocols that go alongside it as well to all these conventions. You've got the regional instruments that I talked about earlier on, the European Convention on Human Rights, for example, that's come about following on from the Universal Declaration. There are a number of questions that are worth asking yourself when you're looking at the concept of human rights. First of all, what is the rule of law? Because that is inextricably linked with this concept of human rights. And the concept of separation of powers is also related to this. And you've got to ask yourself, why are human rights important in a democracy? So I hope the answers to these will kind of become unraveled as we go along. In a mature democracy, the rule of law, the separation of powers, and human rights, they merge one into the other. It's incredibly important. They're the foundations of any mature democracy. So these three principles, the respect for human rights, a pluralist democracy, and the rule of law, is regarded as a single objective by the Council of Europe. And that's an organization that came about following the Second World War to uphold human rights, democracy, and the rule of law in Europe. These are European solutions, and that's part of this European Convention on Human Rights. The Council of Europe is the watchdog for that. The notion of rule of law requires a system of certain and foreseeable law where everyone has a right to be treated by all decision makers with dignity, equality, and rationality in accordance with the laws, and to have the opportunity to challenge decisions before independent and impartial courts through fair procedures. So these words are not just words, but they must really be available in practice to human beings. So they must, public authority must act in accordance with the law, and individuals must have the right to challenge the decisions in front of independent and impartial courts through fair procedures. So the rule of law concept, it's really fundamental to the functioning of a democracy. So a democracy relates to the involvement of the people in the decision-making process in a society. Human rights protect individuals from arbitrary and excessive interferences with their freedoms and liberties. And the rule of law focuses on limiting and independently reviewing the exercise of public powers. So the rule of law promotes democracy by establishing accountability of those wielding public power and by safeguarding human rights, which protect minorities against arbitrary majority rules. So it's not, it doesn't actually protect only the minorities, but it protects everybody. So the individual is therefore protected against the might of the state. So this concept of nobody's above the law, it was kind of coined first by Thomas Fuller 300 years ago. Be you never so high, the law is above you. So Lord Denning talked about this in relation to the exercise of discretion by the Attorney General of the time, saying that just because you're in front of somebody extremely powerful, you mustn't be forced into disregarding the law, because that powerful person can't act with impunity. So that's so nobody's above the law, basically. So the separation of powers is this other concept where you've got to have the a set of checks and balances. So you've got the exercise of the legislative and executive power that must be reviewable for its legality by an independent and impartial judiciary. So a well-functioning judiciary is fundamental to make sure that a democracy functions well and to ensure that the rule of law is upheld. So the separation of powers, you've got on the one hand, you've got the executive, the government, and then on the other hand, you've got the legislature, which is the parliament. And then on the other hand, you've got a separate and independent judiciary that can actually review the decisions of the public authorities. What are the challenges to the separation of powers and this rule of law concept? And you've got potentially abuse of powers by the executive acting without accountability, that the government steamrolling away without accountability, that could be problematic. And then also you've got the absence of equality before the law. So whoever you are, whatever your background, you must be treated equally in front of the law. And then also if you fail to protect minority interests, for example, based on gender or race, etc., then that could be very problematic for the ensuring rule of law. Corruption is a real problem in parts of the world, particularly on the part of the lawmakers, as well as the law upholders, as well as the law enforcers. If you've got corruption that's endemic, then that's really problematic to ensure the rule of law and democracy. Because there's a culture of impunity, you can get away with murder, basically. Therefore, that's extremely problematic too. So you've got nepotism and an absence of meritocracy, arbitrariness. These are also challenges to the rule of law. These are all very kind of part of the culture of any nation. So that's why it's quite difficult to change, and it's very difficult to change overnight. Societal bigotry, one group of the society or faith group thinking they're superior in some way to another, that's really difficult to dislodge. So extremist ideology, that's very difficult to shift. Intolerance and discrimination, those are very difficult to shift in terms of mindsets. And lack of foresight by the executive and the legislature, those are really problematic to ensure the rule of law. So these are all kind of cultural factors which are really challenging to ensure that the rule of law prevails in a country. There must, at the end of the day, there must be effective judicial review to make sure that the decisions are looked at by an independent judiciary. This is a fundamental factor in any country. So that without that, you can expect a chaotic kind of functioning of government. There's also the private actors who might have the task of doing public tasks. So if you do delegate certain functions of state to private enterprise, then the actions of those entities must be equally subject to supervision. So that's why it's quite important when you've got the government handing over control to certain public utility, for example, that there must be ongoing supervision. The relationship between international and domestic law, the domestic legal system must ensure that the state complies with its obligations under international laws. So if it signs up to various treaties and things with other countries, you must make sure that they're complying with human rights laws and decisions of the international courts that are binding on it. And are there clear rules for the implementation of those obligations into domestic law? The lawmaking procedures must be publicly debated by Parliament, and they must be adequately justified. There must be explanatory reports that people can actually understand. So it must be very clear and transparent. Does the public have access to that draft legislation, for example? And can the public have a meaningful debate and have an opportunity to give input into that decision-making process in Parliament? And are there impact assessments of certain decisions made by Parliament? So rather than just steamrolling away into making decisions on behalf of the electorate, it's really important to look very carefully at the impact of any decisions made, especially where there's public expenditure, huge sums of money being spent on certain projects. So proper impact assessments must be made before adopting any legislation. So the impact on human rights and the budgetary impact of laws must be properly considered. You've got certain exceptions, derogations from human rights issues in certain emergency situations, but they really must be emergency, not, they mustn't be misused. So emergency threatening the life of the nation, it must be that serious before you can derogate from human rights. And those derogations must be proportionate. And they must be limited to what's strictly required by the situation and must be limited in duration and circumstance and scope. So, for example, anti-terror legislation, it really must be very limited so that it can't be misused in any way. So there must be parliamentary control and judicial review of that existence of the emergency situation and that derogation. There must be solid and coherent system of law enforcement by public authorities, and the laws must be respected and consistently applied. So it mustn't be arbitrary in terms of, it mustn't be up to the individual police officer to decide whether to take action or not, and depending on who's in front of them. So misuse of powers, there must be legal safeguards to make sure that there is no abuse of power by public authorities. And there must be clear legal restrictions on the use of discretionary power. So there must be some way of checking whether that discretionary power is also reasonable. It's being used reasonably and rationally and legally. So wherever there's a discretion, that must be subject to judicial review. That's what Lord Denning was talking about. Public authorities must be required to provide adequate reasons for their decisions. So you can't just make decisions without providing adequate reasons, because without those reasons, you can't challenge it. So that's why it's important to make sure that proper reasoning is given to any decisions. The equality and non-discrimination, those are, as I said, are fundamental principles and for the rule of law, and the principle of equality of treatment must be contained in a constitution. But you can have things put into a constitution, but the question is whether that's actually available in fact. Even the concept of non-discrimination, is it effectively guaranteed by law? It might be there in the Constitution, it might be there in certain laws, but is it effective? And does it prohibit not only direct discrimination, but also indirect discrimination? Going back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I've put in links here and there to some of the key documents, and you'll see that there is actually these the articles are available in so many different languages, and they are available in Sinhalese and in Tamil as well. So if you put that the language into that search box, you can find it. That's what's called the International Bill of Human Rights. is really the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, together with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Covenant on Economic and Social Cultural Rights. Together they form the International Bill of Human Rights. Again, what are human rights? That's described in this link in very accessible form. Going on to the various articles, the 30 articles, I haven't mentioned them all here, just pulled out a handful of them. So Article 1 begins with the fact that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, and they're endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. That's the founding principle. But then the availability of these rights and freedoms without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national, social origin, property, birth, or other status. That's also very much a fundamental aspect of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 5, that no one shall be subject to torture or cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment or punishment. That is, nobody wants to be tortured, basically. So, it's really important. It's a fundamental right to be protected from that. And equality before the law, non-discrimination, etc. They're very much part of the Universal Declaration. And you'll see that some of these articles that were in the original Declaration on Human Rights were subsequently adopted by the regional instruments as well. So these same articles appear elsewhere in subsequent legislation and subsequent covenants and conventions. So nobody shall be subject to arbitrary arrest or detention or exile. So you're entitled to a fair and public hearing by an independent, impartial tribunal. These are fundamental rights. And this is important. Nobody shall be subject to arbitrary interference with one's privacy, family, home, or correspondence, nor tax upon their honor or reputation. And you must have the right to be protected by law against such interference or attacks. This is very important in a democracy. Right to family and private life is very fundamental to any human being. As I said, you've got on the one hand the constitution of various countries and even the laws of the country that might provide on the face of it protection, but in fact that might not necessarily be available. And as a part of my day-to-day work, I have worked with the state of Pakistan and whether or not they uphold the constitutional guarantees. And so that's why I've chosen Pakistan as a very brief case study. So you've got, for example, the Constitution of Pakistan that guarantees all of these rights because they've signed up to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And for example, in Article 18 of the Declaration, it says that everyone has a right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to challenge change his religion or belief and freedom, either alone or in community with others, and in public or private, to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. Now, this is a constitutionally guaranteed right under the Constitution of Pakistan. And Pakistan signed up to this Universal Declaration, but in actual fact, it is not at all available to anybody who doesn't belong to the mainstream faith. So that's why this constitution, you'll see here that it does talk about various guarantees in terms of safeguards as to educational institutions, respect of religion, etc., and right to practice one's religion, freedom to profess religion and to manage religious institutions, etc. But this is all available in theory, but not really in practice. For example, there was a constitutional amendment in Pakistan declaring certain minority sects as being non-Muslim. And so then subsequently, there was also an amendment to the Pakistan Penal Code. So if you behave in a particular way, if you practice your faith as a non-Muslim by certain minority sects of the Muslim faith, they can actually be put into prison for practicing their faith because they're regarded as non-Muslim. So it's that dire. So what one professes in one's constitution and what actually one does could be very different things. So similarly, the equality of citizens and the rights of women, for example, according to the Constitution of Pakistan, these things are available. You know, when they talk about in the Declaration of Human Rights, when they talk about being free to and having the rights without distinction, without discrimination on grounds of race, color, sex, language, religion, political, other opinion, etc. In actual fact, the position of women, for example, in Pakistan it's quite weak. That's why, for example, you've got US State Department reports on human rights that actually talk about the fact that many women are unaware of these legal protections and are unable to obtain redress. For example, in terms of inheritance, the law entitles female children to only 1/2 of the inheritance of male children. Wives inherit 1/8 of their husband's estates. Women often receive far less than their legal entitlement. So the rights of women, for example, on the face of it, in the Constitution, it's available, but it's not available in fact. So you've got the fact that Pakistan actually signed up to and ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and that permits certain restrictions in certain public emergency situations which threaten the life of the nation. But you will find that the state of Pakistan exceeds those limitations quite regularly. And it is quite worrisome that although under international law you are not allowed to do certain things in the guise of anti-terror actions, and it is obviously a huge problem in Pakistan. Terrorism is a huge problem. There's a lot of activity by Taliban, for example, but under that guise, quite often people's rights are being infringed, and there's arbitrary detentions, prolonged detentions, and torture and inhuman and degrading treatment, all contravening the original plans for the human rights being very much present in the country. So this is what I mean in terms of you can make provision for it in the Constitution, but whether it's actually carried out is a different thing. So you've got also the freedom of opinion and expression under Article 19 of the Universal Declaration, the right to hold opinions without interference, and you've also got the freedom of peaceful assembly and association. So all of these rights are guaranteed by the Universal Declaration, but even those states who've actually signed up to these things may not necessarily carry them out. And even in Europe, there are disturbing trends in Europe where the freedom of opinion and expression are being curtailed quite often. That's something that you need to be aware of. It's not just, although a lot of the human rights laws were initially created in a European context, I'm afraid Europe is also contravening quite a lot of its own values and safeguards. You've also got the right to take part in the government of one's country, equal access to public service, and so on and so forth. You've got the regional human rights instruments, and as I mentioned earlier on, the European Convention on Human Rights, that came about a little bit later after the Universal Declaration, about 10 years later. And the European Court of Human Rights was created to arbitrate on countries that don't uphold the obligations that they've signed up to. And the convention, ECHR, allows people who feel that their rights have been violated by a state, by their national government, and where they can't get remedy at national level, to take up the matter at the European Court of Human Rights. In the UK, for example, the European Convention on Human Rights that we signed up to was enacted into domestic law by the Human Rights Act 1998. But little by little over recent years, in fact, the governments have been trying to whittle away at those rights. And I think June last year, they were presented a Bill of Rights bill, which instead of actually creating more rights, it's actually trying to hack away at the original rights that the forefathers in the European Convention on Human Rights thought to instill in, and in fact, the UK was very much part of the original few who tried to draw up this convention, but we seem to be stepping further and further away from that, which is a real shame. For example, you've got the right to freedom of expression that was in the convention as Article 19, was translated into Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, and then the Article 20 of the original convention, original declaration on freedom of peaceful assembly and association has been translated into Article 11 of ECHR. But then most recently, you've got very draconian bills being brought before Parliament in the UK that infringes on the right to peacefully protest, for example. So there are quite oppressive laws that are coming about in the UK as well. This, as they said, it's quite a worrying trend. I'd like to just play this short video, if I may, as well, if that works. Let me see.
The world is made up of many different countries, cultures, and peoples. Yet despite all these differences, they all have one important thing in common. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. This is what it says in the very first article of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of December 10th, 1948. The notion of human rights has become one of the most important in the history of humankind. Who is responsible for protecting them? And do they really apply to all people? We describe human rights as those rights which apply to every single person, simply because he or she is a human being. They are innate. Human rights apply to every person in every part of the world, without exception. They are therefore universal. They also apply equally to everyone, regardless of race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, skin color, age, or other features that may distinguish one person from another. Human rights are part of international law. The UN Charter of 1946 already contained important passages on the meaning and protection of human rights. The first proper international agreement was the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. In 1966, the UN adopted two more international covenants, one on civil and political rights, and the other on economic, social, and cultural rights. These declarations are collectively known as the International Bill of Human Rights and are the most important legal basis for human rights. In addition, there is a series of UN conventions. For example, the Geneva Convention relating to the status of refugees, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Convention Against Torture, or the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. But what are the specific human rights anchored in these conventions? Human rights are often divided into three generations or dimensions. The first dimension, the classic political and civil liberty rights. These include the right to life and physical integrity, a ban on slavery and forced labor, protection from torture, freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, a comprehensive ban on discrimination, and the right to vote. The second dimension, the economic, social, and cultural human rights. These include the right to work and to a decent wage, the right to form trade unions, equality between men and women, the protection of families, pregnant women, mothers, and children, the right to a decent standard of living, including the right to adequate food, the right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, the right to education, and the right to participate in cultural life. The third dimension deals with the rights of groups. It includes the right to self-determination, the right to development, the right to a clean environment, and the right to peace. The principle of the indivisibility of human rights is important. That means none of the rights listed in the political, economic, social, and cultural human rights may have precedence over the others. Human rights can only be consummated when all facets work together. The exercise of civil and political rights depends on the safeguarding of economic, social, and cultural rights, and vice versa. Who exactly has the job of implementing and upholding human rights? Countries carry the main responsibility. They are obliged to refrain from any action that would violate human rights, must protect them from violation, and create the necessary conditions for people to fully exercise their human rights. The UN's central body is the Human Rights Council, a body of 47 countries based in Geneva. It reviews the situation on human rights on a regular basis in all of the UN member states. It can also send independent experts to individual countries. The problem: there are many countries on the Council which do not themselves uphold human rights. The UN Security Council concerns itself particularly with the protection of human rights during wars and armed conflicts. For example, it works to end the recruitment of child soldiers. The High Commissioner for Human Rights is responsible for coordinating the human rights work of the entire UN body. She has local offices in all parts of the world and can send human rights experts to UN peace missions. The International Criminal Court in The Hague. With its establishment in 1998, the world has an authority capable of investigating and passing sentence on particularly grave breaches of human rights: genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Its powers are still limited now. It lacks the support of important countries like the USA and China. But a crucial step has been taken. War criminals can no longer commit their transgressions with impunity. Along with the global institutes of the UN, there are various regional human rights agreements and bodies. The European Convention on Human Rights and the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. The African Charter on Human and People's Rights. And the American Convention on Human Rights. Civil society has an especially important role to play. Non-governmental organizations such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch monitor the observance of human rights in places all over the world. They draw attention to abuses and exert pressure on governments through public campaigns. They also play an important role in the ongoing development of the legal basis for human rights. The creation of independent national institutes for human rights, which have an indispensable role as watchdogs, is also important. Are there any controversial aspects about human rights? Yes, there are two main points of contention. Issue number one: the universal nature of human rights. The argument: the notion of human rights originates in the West and cannot simply be transferred to other cultures. It is true, the development and spread of the notion of human rights carry the marks of cultural developments and traditions. But it is also true that no human being wants to be tortured or discriminated against because of her religion or skin color. Every human being wants to be able to speak his opinion without fear of persecution. Every human being wants a life of dignity with a roof over her head, without having to suffer hunger or thirst. All these ideas are included in the notion of the universality of human rights. It is important to note that it is frequently countries or groups which are themselves responsible for human rights violations that call this universality into question. Issue number two: Western countries are accused of using human rights as a pretext for military intervention in other countries and of committing human rights abuses themselves. It is clear, no country is the sole defender of human rights. Human rights are violated in Western countries too. Especially following the attacks of 9/11, measures were introduced that compromised human rights. The justification, the war on terrorism. We see that human rights are very particular rights. They apply equally to every individual. Respect for and protection of human rights must be at the heart of government activity, since human beings are both the reason for and the object of every policy. People do not exist for the state, but the state for people. The struggle to secure and defend human rights must be continually renewed, for we can only secure permanent peace and stability if we respect human rights.
Okay, I hope that was a useful resume of some of those concepts. Going on, there's also the human rights budget issues. For example, the Scottish Human Rights Commission says it's important to think through how people's rights are impacted by the way that money is raised, allocated, and spent. Specifically, budget decisions should reflect human rights standards, and the process of formulating, approving, executing, and auditing the budget should reflect human rights principles. When a government spends money on things, they need to have a regard to human rights and also the consequence impact of their impact assessments, and things are particularly important when they use public funds. In terms of redress under the UN, you can report violations. You can turn to the Human Rights Council, and there's a mechanism for doing all of that. But the ideal would be if these principles are incorporated into not only constitutions, but also enacted into national domestic laws so that people can have immediate access to protection of their human rights. Looking at this resolution of the UN Human Rights Council from October of last year in relation to Sri Lanka promoting reconciliation, accountability, and human rights in Sri Lanka, the resolution 51.1, they said in the preamble, they talked about the fact that corruption can have a serious negative impact on the enjoyment of human rights, and that the poor and those in marginalized and vulnerable situations, including women and girls, are at particular risk. So there are a number of Sri Lanka specific documents that I've put links to on here. Amnesty International reports, for example, there are links here if you're interested. The UK Home Office, Visas and Immigration, for example, they create country policy information notes, and they say, for example, the lack of any constitutional protection or anti-discrimination laws or policies has exposed the LGBTIQ individuals to pervasive discriminatory treatment in all aspects of daily life, including employment, housing, healthcare, education, and law enforcement. So there are specific issues that are being looked at by different other countries are watching, and the LGBTIQ community remains fearful of a police force that's known for a culture of intolerance and abuse towards them. There are also US State Department reports and Human Rights Watch reports on not only Sri Lanka, but all the other countries as well. And as I said, as well as the Declaration of Human Rights being universal, some of the state failures are unfortunately also universal. Okay, that's about all I wanted to say. There is a PDF of the PowerPoint which Chula will circulate afterwards. I hope you'll be able to find useful links there. Is that all right, Chula?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Nilmini. it was such an important subject, but you put everything into that 1 hour so lecture and really compact, and I felt so heavy in trying to understand all that. And so it's time for questions, and I also have a questions for you. Maybe I can start, and then I haven't got anybody raised hands yet. So the first one, I mean, you had a slide that referred to rule of law and the culture eroding into it. So you had like 11, 12 items into it, and Sri Lanka is a perfect example that we have eroded into all those items that you listed in there, including lack of accountability by the government and so on. Perfect example is now actually in existence, where the IMF agreement that was signed and agreed, and now it's presented for debate in the parliament. You see what I mean? It's in the reverse direction in Sri Lanka. So my question is that if something is there in the constitution, right, and if it's not taking effect or ignored, then is it not the judiciary is at fault? Or how can we rectify that?
I mean, fault is a difficult word. I think if you've got a culture where you don't safeguard fundamental rights, and you don't have an independent judiciary that's watchful and is entitled to practice their profession without fear, that causes problems to actual independent judicial thinking. So I don't know the full extent of problems in Sri Lanka itself. I haven't studied it very closely, but speaking in general terms, if you don't give way to, if a country doesn't create the conditions where you can uphold human rights through having that separation of powers, where the government is accountable, it's the decision making of the government is separate, and there's an independent judiciary watching the actions of the government who can judicially review the steps taken by the government and public authorities, then that causes lots of problems. So the shifting a culture, it's very difficult to do overnight. So it's not necessarily the fault of the judiciary, but obviously a judiciary must be able to make decisions without having to look over their shoulders, worrying if they make a decision, is that going to offend somebody? Is that going to mean that I might lose my job? You know, that sort of thing shouldn't be happening.
Right. So
that one, if I may just tell
you
you something based on my knowledge. My knowledge on law is limited, but as far as I am aware, any enactment by Parliament can be referred to the Supreme Court to decide whether it is in contravention of the Constitution. So there is a judicial process that comes into play with that. Secondly, if there is any enactment where a person's fundamental rights are being violated, then that person has the right to go before the Supreme Court and seek redress as well. So these are the two things as far as I know, and as I say again, my knowledge on this is limited, but as far as Sri Lanka is concerned, I believe what I said is correct.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of challenge, the constitutionality of acts can be reviewed by the courts. Then you've got this situation where can the judiciary act independently without fear? So that's the other thing we need to bear in mind. In theory, challenges are possible, and in theory, if you've got a judicial system that can work swiftly, mete out fair procedures and mete out fair laws and mete out fair decisions, that's fantastic. But if you've got a system that is a little bit, I'm not saying that this is the case in Sri Lanka because I haven't practiced in Sri Lanka as a lawyer, but if you've got a very Kafkaesque system where you don't have easy access to justice, And it's very, very problematic to bring a case before the courts. And if you've got cronism, if you've got other cultural issues that might prevent access to justice, whatever you've got in terms of, in theory, you can do such and such, but the question is, can you do it in practice? So that's where the cultural shift is problematic.
Any other questions? Yeah, two people have. Udita, yes, Udita. Udita?
Hi, Nilmini. Thank you for that talk. I, of course, don't know much about judicial matters, but I just want to ask you of some specific situations in Sri Lanka, which I have been extremely concerned about. And obviously, no action has been taken at any time. Many drug lords or criminals when under arrest are being bumped off by the police. Many times it has happened maybe over the last 10 years, particularly under the Rajapaksas. The story is the same. The story is that they are taken to show something somewhere, and they try to escape, or they try to get weapons, and they were killed by the police. That's the sort of crux of the story always. As far as I know, I mean, whenever I have seen people under arrest coming to hospitals, their legs are chained, arms are chained, and they can't do anything at all to run away or do anything violent. They can't do anything. The thing is, a right to life is a human right, and I think these issues have been reported, but I haven't seen any of these being investigated, and the perpetrators are punished, particularly the police people being punished for failure to act, failure to protect. And in my opinion, they are the murderers. So that's one situation. The other one is torture is rampant in Sri Lanka under police custody. You may be an innocent person being arrested, but when you go to the police station, you're being tortured, and I don't see any action taken by the against the police on those situations. And one other situation is that if a poor person has to bring a case against some injustice, I think in UK there's a fund they can access, government fund they can access to pay for their court case. Is there anything in Sri Lanka? Because without that, no poor person can bring a case against the establishment or any powerful person, because simply they don't have ways and means to pay for it. Sorry, there are three questions I would like to your answer, if possible.
Sure. I mean, police brutality is something that obviously goes with corruption and misuse of powers. So that's why, you know, if you've got a culture of impunity, abuse of power, those are cultural things that are very difficult to shift overnight. And the only way you can do that is to make sure that not only are there laws, but there's also action taken swiftly and decisively by those in charge to make sure that that kind of action is not permitted. within the police force. That's for the whole system to act swiftly and make sure it doesn't happen. But that's part of the cultural thing as well, isn't it? If it's been endemic for generations, then it's very difficult to shift overnight. But it can happen with anything if you've got some teeth, so if you've got some punitive measures, and they're actually in effect, you know, if they're put into effect, then people will stop. So, for example, in the UK, in terms of race relations, until the Race Relations Act, this goes back to the 70s, people were quite, you know, there's a permissive kind of culture. You could be very degrading towards people, but now people are extremely careful what they say, because there's a punishment at the end of it if you don't follow the rules. So it's punitive measures that are available that make people comply with the rules. But then over time, society shifts because there are laws and punishments associated with the failure to comply with the law. Bit by bit, society changes. And now, you know, 50 years on, the UK society is very much more mindful of race relations issues. So things take time to change. That's one thing. In relation to your question about whether in Sri Lanka there's a system of legal aid, I really don't know. I'd like to know about that. But unfortunately, even in the UK, legal aid, which is the fund that's available for individuals who are aggrieved in some way to take actions, it's been whittled away over the years to become nearly meaningless. So loads and loads of legal aid lawyers, people who used to practice so that the individual who didn't have the means could go to a lawyer and get advice through legal aid, where the government budget actually pays for the lawyer. That's become so meaningless that the lawyers can't afford to pay for their own bills with the amount of money that that's paid to them. So a lot of lawyers have actually stopped doing legal aid work, which means access to justice is being denied to the poor. So because legal aid isn't available for so many different things anymore. So even within the UK, legal aid funds have been whittled down to very little. I mean, the barristers were on strike not so long ago because of the fact that in the criminal bar there wasn't enough funds being paid. So you know, you spend years studying and learning to become a barrister, and then you earn less than somebody who's serving in McDonald's. So that's the kind of situation we've got even in the UK, and it's not available in every European country either. So I don't know is the answer to that, whether in Sri Lanka they've got some kind of legal aid fund available, but access to justice is so key. Otherwise the poor and the vulnerable will go without redress.
There's no legal aid in Sri Lanka, maybe in a way, given that most of our basic cases go for more than 5 years, quite a lot of maybe being saved in that sense, but okay, that's more, but there's no legal aid system in Sri Lanka.
I mean, that's
to my knowledge, I think at least the Aragale activities who are brought into court there, I think there are a few lawyers who are defending them free of charge. So that's the kind of thing that is there.
I mean, the lot of lawyers.
But as a society, if there's no legal aid for poor people, then justice is denied, isn't it? I mean, as simple as that. They have not got any way of bringing up any cases against either the government or individuals, because simply they don't have money. So justice is denied.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the problem. And as lawyers, I mean, we've done a lot of pro bono cases where we work free of charge to the client because of the importance of the case to the client they don't have any means, but also because there's an important principle of law, so it's worthwhile fighting for it. But there's a limit to how much you can keep doing pro bono work depending on what resources you've got. Some of the very large city firms, they've actually got pro bono units because they can cross-fund it. Not everybody can afford to do that and afford to pay their own bills. So therefore, a lot of lawyers don't take up pro bono work. They can't do legal aid work anymore because you can do 50 hours worth of work and be paid for about 3 hours of it. So that's the state of legal aid even in the UK. But as you quite rightly said, if you don't have legal aid, you will be denying justice to a lot of people. And that's a sad state of access to justice across many countries.
Okay, thanks, Nilmini. There are 4 people waiting. Can I take up Soraya's question? Soraya.
Oh, thank you. And thank you, Chula, and of course, thank you, Nilmini. I think this information that we're hearing should be disseminated with the public because, as you pointed out, Sri Lanka has no culture, nor does it have a conscience when it comes to human rights. So my question is directly related to the role the international community can play. Because if you know, I think in the 70s, we enacted the PTA, a draconian piece of legislation. And people have been agitating to repeal that. Notwithstanding that, now they bring the ATA, Anti-Terrorism Act, in which one of the major components is that before a detention order had to be signed by the Minister of Defense, but now the DIG can sign a detention order for 12 months. That is the level of human rights in Sri Lanka. Recently, we heard the European Parliament saying that GSP provisions might be withheld for Sri Lanka. So I'm coming from the opinion that unless some international pressure is borne on Sri Lanka, nothing can change. And how do you see that, that particular angle in terms of holding Sri Lanka accountable for these human rights violations blatantly, brazenly?
Yeah, I mean, the fact that somebody can be detained for a prolonged period without judicial intervention, without being brought before a judge for bail, that is very concerning. That on the whim potentially of an individual police officer, that somebody can be detained for such a long time, and that goes back to the misuse of powers. Abuse of the laws. And so when you enact laws that cater for that kind of potential abuse, the country needs to review that very seriously, and then believe that resolution 51.1 of the UN Human Rights Council did look at this particular bill, this particular law. So it is important to highlight that internationally and keep the light focused on very problematic provisions that are being brought in. The media can help perhaps, and sometimes governments tend to back down when they get bad press. And certainly in the UK, whenever the UK government tries to enact provisions that are potentially problematic in human rights terms, the media stepping in can sometimes make the government think twice. So keeping the spotlight on things like that is quite important. As well as legal challenges, of course.
Anything else?
And it's really important to promote enactment of international treaties into domestic law. That way people have direct access to it, rather than having to go to an international organ. But you've got a culture where there is corruption, nepotism and the ability to pay your way out of things, or depending on who you are. So it's very arbitrary, and it's not there's no equality before the law, and there's no non-discrimination in public authorities acts. That's where it's very difficult to shift.
Yes, Soraya, anything else? Okay, Lakshman, sorry, yeah.
No, I think for Sri Lankans, we have exhausted all avenues within the country. I think we are now looking for some, like the treaty bodies, the EU, the US. I don't know how the IMF, how they're engaging Sri Lanka without some preconditions on human rights. It's in a very abysmal state, I would like to say. And if there are any ways in which we can move the international world, I'm thinking whether we should explore that, Nilmini, as well.
Yeah, I mean, I was under the impression that the IMF loan was conditional on certain human rights conditions, but obviously, you know, those who are in Sri Lanka need to make more noise about this, and perhaps actually, you know, take this up again with the Human Rights Council, UN Human Rights Council. The EU, you know, when governments act, they are supposed to uphold human rights, but then you need to make sure that there's a spotlight brought into any failure, so that international community, the bloc's trading partners, they take account of what's going on and make sure that governments are held to account.
Tough
Right.
task, but has to be done. Thank you, Nilmini.
Tough task, yeah,
Okay.
very difficult.
Thank you, Soraya. We can't really give up despite being dismal, so we're trying anyway. So Lakshman has raised his hand. Lakshman next. There are two more to go as well. Lakshman, yes, Lakshman.
Thank you, Jula. Thank you, Nilmini, for the excellent presentation. I am also a layman to this field. I have three basic questions. Question number one, what is the main difference between human rights and fundamental rights? Question number one. Question number two, how many of these UN declarations or UN treaties have gone into our Sri Lankan constitution to become legally binding? Then are there any success stories from Sri Lanka or from other countries where these human rights issues have been taken up and sorted out in favor of the citizen? Any examples? And finally, number three is our Prevention of Terrorism Act, the new version. How legal it is from the point of view of human rights.
Yeah, I mean, human rights and fundamental rights are pretty much the same thing. Human rights are fundamental rights. But as I mentioned, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948, it's a declaration. It's up to the governments of various countries who've signed up to it to then incorporate those things into their own constitution and then onto their national laws as well. I haven't studied Sri Lankan constitution, but I would expect that all of these guarantees in the Declaration on Human Rights from 48 are incorporated into the Sri Lankan constitution because Sri Lanka signed up to it. But as I said, whether a state signs up to it and in fact delivers on that is a different thing. They're two separate things. So this is where I keep going back to the cultural context. If in a particular country, just because you've signed up to something, it doesn't mean that you're following it. And therefore, it's up to the citizens to make sure that they elect people who will fight their corner and make sure that laws are enacted nationally, at national level, to make sure that those rules are adhered to by their governments and successive governments, and that there are checks and balances put in to make sure that no individual wielding executive power can overstep those rules. So this is where constitutional amendments, national laws must be enacted, but also given effect. So if you don't have proper separation of powers, if you don't have an independent judiciary who can act impartially and swiftly to safeguard those laws, if you don't have a police that's upholding the law, if the police themselves are feared by the general public, that's very problematic. So it's a whole shift in culture, but also with any changes to the law, unless it's got teeth, unless there's some way of enforcing it, people don't tend to follow the rules. So it's only if there's some, and there must be a will. If people don't have the will to carry it through, and if people are fearful, and that comes from the lack of separation of powers and the lack of rule of law. So that's why I was saying, for a mature democracy, you need that rule of law to be in effect, to be effective, and also for the separation of powers and upholding of human rights. Otherwise, you don't have a proper democracy and the whole system collapses.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay.
I'm not sure.
Thank you for that answer, Nilmini. Next, I have Ranjan. Ranjan, please. Ranjan.
Ranjan, you're muted, I think. Ranjan, your mute button's on.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
We can hear you now.
Sorry. Thank you, Chula. Thank you, Nilmini. That was a very substantial presentation, exposition of human rights. Extremely detailed and very substantial. I congratulate you for that. Now, a few of my comments. Point one, the human rights talk only of rights. See, every right, as far as I know and am aware, every right has an equal and opposite obligation. You see, teaching people rights only has created an unbalanced, lopsided values. I don't know about other countries. Having lived in my country as long as this long, I can see that people are only worried about their rights. They are not at all, they don't care at all for their obligations. I think this is a serious omission, looking back on my life in Sri Lanka, having lived so long as I have. You see, nobody seems to be caring two hoots about their obligations. They are only talking about their rights. Look at all the trade unions, how they are behaving, what they are demanding. I saw a bit of Sri Lanka when I was young. Take the railways. You see, they are always fighting for rights. When I was in the army so many years ago, you see the railways, it was a pleasure to go to Jaffna by night mail. You know, they were so comfortable. Today, good heavens, I would not step into a train now, because look at the state of the latrines. You see, look at the state of those trains. They are not washed for years. See, not clean at all. What happened to all the obligations? But they all want rights. They say salary is not enough. They keep on asking pay rises. So this was a serious flaw in formulating human rights, completely ignoring and forgetting and not recognizing the corresponding obligations that we have, that we also have. That's point one. The second point is these human rights are formulated about 70 years ago, right? The world of 2023 is not the world of 1948. Do I have to explain that any further? The world of 2023 is not the world of 1948. The circumstances that gave rise to the emergence of a code of laws on human rights, I think it was mainly the Holocaust, how the Jews were treated. That is how this, I think this is it was one of the main reasons for human rights. But today, you see, the world has changed so much. And in the application of human rights, so many obstacles have cropped up. Even I'm thinking of the Sri Lankan context. I think Soraya mentioned a few. See, the Sri Lankan context, it's meaningless. These human rights in Sri Lanka is absolutely, it's only theory, it's academic. It's only in the universities and libraries. You can't apply and get relief for one's human rights. Udita mentioned one example, the cost of litigation. If my human rights are violated and if I want to go to court to obtain relief, how much will it cost me? How much will it cost me to retain an average lawyer? Do you know how much it costs in Sri Lanka? A day, at least 500,000 rupees. A good lawyer, a president's counsel, will not pay for less than 1 million rupees for a day. How many in Sri Lanka can afford that? Can a poor person afford it? Can a middle class person afford it? Can an upper middle class person afford it? Only the wealthy can afford it. Wealthy people, just few. So it is that is one example. Then human rights again. You talked about employment, education. Why are people running away from Sri Lanka? Everyone in Sri Lanka has right to find employment within this country. Nobody has it is not the obligation of Korea, South Korea, or a Middle Eastern country to provide employment for Sri Lankans. They failed. Education. Anyone who can afford it, anyone who can afford it, will want to send his children abroad for education. Why? Because our education system has totally failed. Right? That is the reason. Yeah. So you see, in many ways, I think now the point I'm driving at now is that the situation in 2023 has totally changed, and we have to have a look at, have to revisit these human rights and see what progress has been achieved. I dare say a lot of progress has been achieved. I say so, I admit it. But there are also equally and insurmountable obstacles which have got to be cleared. So we have to revisit these human rights in the light of the 2023 world. That is the second point. And find solutions so that this human rights movement can move forward and be more successful in the future years.
Yeah, I
Then-
think you're, yeah, sorry.
I haven't finished. Yeah, so I think it was you. I think you mentioned that in Sri Lanka, in Europe, also Europeans also found difficulties in obtaining solutions within their own countries. So the vice council in Europe prevailed, and they created an European Court of Human Rights. See? That's admissible. So that is a partial solution. If within your country, if you can't obtain relief, at least you can go to an outside source from which you can get relief. I think that was a point that Soraya mentioned, and that is at least a partial solution. With regard to legal aid, this legal aid, Udita mentioned legal aid. Yes, in Sri Lanka, there was a legal aid commission. It is still there. The legal aid commission is still there. But unfortunately, that legal aid commission does not have the resources, the funds to retain lawyers. And they are at the moment, it's not very effective and not strong enough. So it would be a good idea if somebody draws the attention of the government and to fund this legal aid commission, to allocate money in the budget to this commission, so that this commission can help poor litigants who want to go to court, to obtain the relief they want. See, that is one way in which the sovereignty of the ordinary man, the sovereignty of the people can be strengthened. Custodial debts. Well, yes, custodial debts in principle is bad. Nobody says it is right. But that is the practical answer the police have found. They are caught between the devil and the deep blue sea. See, they have to do their job. When they do their job properly, the politicians interfere and criticize them. And when the criminals get away, the public criticizes the police. So they are caught between the devil and the deep blue sea, and they find the way out, and they are silent. Nobody is talking on their behalf. Nobody is defending them. So what they they have found this solution of taking these die-hard criminals who cannot be corrected. And they say, well, he tried to escape, and he attacked us, and we had to defend ourselves, and he died in the firefight. So this is a practical way out that the police have found to get over this difficulty. The solution is not what these theoreticians in universities preach. You have to analyze it analyze the real problem and remove the causes. Well, I'll stop there, Chula. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ranjan. Nilmini, yes, I think.
I think Chula, Ranjan made some really valid points. We can't just talk about rights. There must be obligations as well, but there are, on the one hand, obligations of the state towards the individual, and then the individuals themselves have not only rights, but they must also have obligations towards each other, as well as towards the state. So one of them might be actually contributing to one's taxes as well as voting and things like that. So if people contribute to their taxes, those taxes can then be used for the provision of various services to others, and also in particular even allowing access to justice through a legal aid fund. but there must be an organization, there must be will for people to make sure that they urge their MPs to make sure that those funds are allocated in a particular way. So you've got perhaps more pressing priorities in Sri Lanka when you've got 1/5 of the population in poverty, then obviously those things must take precedence, making sure that children have food in their stomachs before anything else, and then that they have an education. So all those things are fundamental. The second point that Ranjan made was that the Universal Declaration dates to 1948 in a completely different context. True, but I would probably say that a lot of those issues raised in the Declaration and interpretations given to those fundamental rights still hold today. So as a human being, you've got the needs, certain basic needs, and those are met and covered by that Universal Declaration. That's why that as an instrument, it's still valid today in terms of your basic needs as a human being, for shelter, food, education, all those things are protected by it. But the question is, do governments who've signed up to it, do they actually uphold those principles and ensure that human rights are made available, laws are made available to people in their countries? So that's the difficult part, to making sure that your own government abides by its own obligations. So the human rights is really about individual rights vis-a-vis the almighty state. But individuals have rights towards rights, but also obligations towards each other as well as towards the state. So there's a different elements of the different sides of the same coin, I guess.
Okay, Nilmini, thanks for that. And I think Sanjeev has raised the hand again. Sanjeeva, yes.
Yeah, thanks, Jula. And thanks, Nilmini, for that comprehensive presentation. And I concur with most of what you have, what you listed as well as what you said. And as a person who contributes to the newspapers in Sri Lanka regularly in my own name, I certainly cherish the freedom of expression. And I must say to people who live abroad, I can say that I have been doing so since 2018, including the period under Gotabaya Rajapaksa. And I have never had any perceived threat or any feedback about any criticism I have made about the government. And I must say that my late brother, who contributed articles from 2013 on a weekly basis, also never had any feedback of consequences arising, despite many of our friends saying that a white van might appear. I think that this was largely explained recently by Jehan Pereira, pretty activist, saying that as long as your writings are non-political, I mean that as long as you don't belong to a political party and do make criticism of the government in terms of their actions, pretty much it has been tolerated. I mean, I'm sure there will be many people who will cite cases otherwise, but generally I feel pretty comfortable and safe in criticizing the government from a factual point of view, not on a political or from a political perspective. The second point I want to make is I believe that most international players who today subject countries like Sri Lanka and other South Asian countries to human rights are pretty hypocritical, because, they are pretty comfortable in turning a blind eye to the lack of those human rights in the Middle East and others because of economic reasons, while obviously, poorer countries like Sri Lanka is being held to account. So in that context, not that I have a major problem in anyone raising issues with regards to abuse of human rights, but I think international intervention in Sri Lanka needs to be perceived from a perspective that it's not really in our own interest, but they are doing it more from a political plus various other issues that concern them. Thirdly, the final point is that, I believe that under certain circumstances, certain rights rights of people need to be withheld. As I mean, you quite correctly pointed out, during a war, certain rights are withheld. But I consider the current situation, the economic situation, to be as critical as a war. And in that context, I think it was about 2 years ago, I wrote an article saying that, in my view, industrial action by the public sector workers must be banned for 5 years. Now, I know some people don't agree, but I believe that the interest of a few thousands cannot override the interest of the rest of the population. And, I find that, my thinking is along the lines that, now, if you take a country like Singapore, which we all admire for both what they have achieved economically as well as socially, under Lee Kuan Yew, most of those rights were withheld. So there was a culture which was not maybe open pattern charging type of action, but the culture was there that, look here, you cannot demonstrate, you cannot engage in trade union action in order that the country can go forward. So in that context, Nilmini, I believe, I know it might not be very popular, but at least in the next few years, I would certainly support any action that the government takes in suppressing industrial action by public sector workers. I mean, those are my observations.
Thank you.
The difficulty in curbing right to peaceful assembly and association is that if you allow a government to step in and curb those rights for the immediate term because of some pressing socioeconomic needs, they will continue to do so when there is no such need. So there's a little bit of a danger in equating a financial crisis with a situation of war. So I think whilst there are serious imperatives in a financial crisis, we've got to be very careful about allowing a government to overstep the mark. I don't know what they did in Singapore, but Singapore's considered a muscled democracy, isn't it? It's so I mean, they've achieved huge economic success perhaps, but I don't know at what cost. So there are good things and bad things in every state. It's a matter of taking whatever's good, but being very careful about certain things that can then lead to abuse of power by those wielding the power. So there must always be checks and balances. That's the point I'm trying to make.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? There are 15 minutes more for us to talk. If there's anything else. There was a very little question in the chat. Saman Amarakorn, I don't know whether he wants to ask about the United Nations, and he asked why only some countries have veto power. Nilmini, any ideas?
I don't know if I'm competent to answer that question, really. I don't know the full functioning of how the system of veto works in the UN, but obviously, countries are perhaps allowed certain number of votes, but I really don't know enough to say one way or the other on that one.
Right, okay, thank you. I think we had a very good discussion today, and thank you for all that, because we really need to understand the system as well, and where we can go for help, and what help is missing in Sri Lanka and what we can do. And also knowing that there's a cultural change or cultural attitude changes is needed for us to get ourselves on track. So we are doing, I think, trying to do it the right way, but we don't know how much it will be effective, but we can still keep going and try to improve. So thank you very much. And I must say, I will send the slide set to you with the link for the YouTube video to everybody who has got the emails with me. And thank you, Nilmini. Any other comments at all? Right.
No, thank you
And
for.
maybe Chula ask one question from Nilmini. I mean, Nilmini, I know in today's presentation as well as in some of the WhatsApp exchanges, you have highlighted the UK government in attempting to limit certain freedoms. What do you feel is the reason for that? What is it that has brought about? I mean, we always hold the British as great examples of justice and all that. What is it that has happened in the UK in the last couple of decades, which has brought about a view that from the government, at least, that they need to curtail some of the unlimited freedoms that the people enjoy?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. There was a time when the UK was held up as a beacon of democracy and good reason and must be emulated and so on and so forth. I'm probably going beyond my remit here, but I think electing certain individuals who don't really have regard to the will of the electorate, but kind of bulldozing their way through life, that culture has perpetuated itself, unfortunately, and some of the the leaders of the country, people in positions of power, have become less and less interested in human rights and other issues that protect the citizen. It's more to do with one's own power rather than the rights of individuals within the nation. So I'm afraid the UK that you probably once knew is not the same UK anymore.
Isn't the judiciary, but isn't the judiciary in the UK? I mean, I saw you had put in one of your slides, Lord Denning's rebuttal of the Attorney General's view that he should be entitled to make any law. So don't you have a judicial activism in UK as they had under people like Lord Denning?
Well, there is perhaps a more independent judiciary in the UK than in most other countries, but some of the appointments made by recent prime ministers, let's say, have kind of whittled away that independence, have whittled away democracy, have whittled away individual rights. And so now there's actually a move towards curbing human rights in the UK as well. And I know we've got the intervening pandemic, we've got the Ukraine war that's affecting the UK quite seriously, and affecting our cost of living and all sorts of things. But there was a leading up to and just immediately subsequent to the Brexit issue. So we've had the triple whammy in the UK, the Ukraine war, the pandemic, plus Brexit. That's made for a set of circumstances, and there's a certain culture of impunity even within government until recently. I think that the current government is behaving a little bit better than the predecessors, but in terms of upholding rights, things have been whittled away in recent years, which is quite sad.
Okay, thanks. That's all, Chula.
Thank you. Ranjan, final question. Yes, Ranjan.
Yeah, a very brief intervention. I agree with what Sanjeev mentioned. He mentioned that in Singapore, some of these rights were suspended by Lee Kuan Yew. Sri Lanka also needs something like that suspension. You know, Sri Lanka can never be turned around the way we want it under a democracy. We need a strong executive is an absolute essential. A strong executive, right? But the difference is here. You see, we don't have a man of the caliber of Lee Kuan Yew whom we can trust with that strong powers, with those executive powers. The lot we have are all suspect, and that is where the problem lies in Sri Lanka. If we can find someone you see, who's as honest, honorable, and honorable Lee Kuan Yew, okay, then I don't think the people will have any grudge or any second thoughts in giving those powers to such a person. But certainly to not anyone on the stage at the moment. Thank you.
And as I mentioned earlier on, curbing rights, it's got to be extremely carefully done and only as far as absolutely necessary and limited in time, and where the life of the nation is at threat. So financial crisis means that the life of the nation is at threat. There may be certain restrictions that might be necessary, but we've got to be very careful about who you hand that power to and how long they wield that power. So there must be very serious checks and balances in place before you allow anybody to have to exert individual executive power. So that's the caveat to any one person or president or a government being entitled to curb people's fundamental rights.
Thank you, Nilmini, with that caution in relation to curbing the rights as well. So thank you very much for everybody. It was a very good discussion and an eye-opener for us. So we will probably we'll have to continue with this debate at some point later on with further developments, and we'll do that. Yeah. Thank you for everybody. Yeah. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.